So in terms of the journal entry sequence we have in Chapter 8, we are actually focusing on departments now. Okay, notice in Chapter 4, it was a building block chapter. We used the concept of product cost, which is gone now. You'll never hear about it on any exam or any place in this class. It was just used to teach you how the system worked. The first real aspect you had was in Chapter 5 when we did the job order costing and you had jobs. Okay, that was real. So that was a new introduction in Chapter 5. Chapter 8, in addition to all this other stuff we're doing, we're introducing departments as the basis of our accounting. So departments are now a crucial part of the journal entry. Every journal entry in WIP, you have to identify the department that's not with that. And we assume that everything will move from the warehouse, like a direct material warehouse, not into the factory, but into a specific department in the factory, and then move from one department to the next department to the next department. Now, in that process, they can pick up variable and fixed overhead from each department. The more sophisticated places will have a different fixed and variable overhead account in each department, and so a product can pick those costs up. But a key thing is this concept of departments. Okay? Now that is just on the accounting side, right? But one of the biggest problems we have is in terms of the HR management and the incentivization. And this goes back, or not goes back, it's related to that Dan Pink stuff about how you evaluate people, punishments and rewards. So one thing that happens is in the Anglo-Axis, we assume, in effect, when we're doing our performance evaluation, that the manager and the department are the same thing. That if the department does poorly, the manager gets a poor performance evaluation. If you're a manager, the only way to get a good performance evaluation is to have your department perform well, okay? And steady with me on this. You guys think that's normal. Guess what? It's not the same in other parts of the world. In all of Japan, and that would, so notice the core of where we get world-class manufacturing. And as far as I know, in most of Northern Europe, I can promise you, in Sweden, it's also the norm, that the managers and the departments are evaluated on completely separate systems. That the department can be terrible and the manager still get a good rating, and vice versa. The manager can be very, very terrible. Sorry, I'm getting this backwards. The manager can get a terrible evaluation and the department still can perform outstandingly well. Well, because a lot of departmental performance is things that are in the economy that are outside of the department, have nothing to do with the manager. So in the places I'm talking about, which would be all of Japan, every organization, and a lot of Scandinavia, departments are evaluated based on numbers like what we have here. So I'm going to flip this around again. So departments would be evaluated based on these numbers. That your goal in the department is actually to have a zero variance, and zero variances would be considered great performance. Maybe even better would be to have a positive variance, but that's not even necessary because remember, these are based on, the variances are based on forecast items. So we built some profit into the forecast. In most cases, they've done that. So actually getting a zero variance means that you met your profit target. Okay? So in most places in the Anglo world, they would take that variance and that would be how I would be evaluated as a manager. And if I had a terrible variance, a negative variance, I would lose my performance evaluation. I could lose part of my career, not get a promotion, not get a transfer. In Japan, that would never happen. And in Scandinavia, I'm not as certain in Scandinavia, but the companies I know about in Scandinavia, that also would never happen. In those two places, this is still used to evaluate the department. They will still use the variance and compute it, and that will evaluate the department itself. But the manager is evaluated on a totally different basis, a completely subjective basis. So there will be a report written, and I'm familiar with the reports at Scania. So Scania is the truck company that I mentioned occasionally. Here is what every Scania manager is expected to do. Okay? The manager's primary duty, okay, is to create an environment where the workers are able to do their best work. Period. That's it. And they will be evaluated by multiple people against that criteria. Now notice, how would you measure that with numbers? Like, is that even a number measurable thing? You know, maybe you could pick up a few bits of that with numbers, but in whole, that would be, you know, you're not going to be able to get a comprehensive assessment of that with anything that you can count. Okay? So what they have is several layers of managers above that person will spend in a year several multi-day periods with that person, shadow them, and also interview all the subordinates. And that's the same thing they do for plant managers. So every Scania plant is assigned a board of directors member who is the evaluator for that plant. So if you're on the board of directors of Scania, you are assigned 1 or 2 factories that you have to go there and produce a written report. You have to go there about 3 times a year. You will be there 3 to 4 days every time you're there. You're expected to interview every level of employee at the factory. Custodial workers, hourly workers, first line supervisors, second line supervisors, engineering workers, support workers, IT staff workers. You're expected to interview the working staff of the supplier companies that deliver supplies to the factory. You know, like, does the factory make it easy for you to deliver the supplies, the incoming raw materials and things? And then you're expected to go out to the supplier and interview them and say, is this factory easy to deal with? Are they doing things to help you and, you know, do your business better so that you can, you know, make it cheaper for us? Because if we're making it easy for you, we want some of that back. And then they write a report, right? And the report is telling the story. Did the factory manager create a circumstance in that factory where all these people that I talk to think that they have the opportunity to do a good job, where they have the opportunity to work hard and be effective at their job? Okay? And if that is good, if that evaluation is good, then the manager gets a high rating, you know. And if you're a factory manager, some of your bonus would be based on this, right? They would say, okay, if you're a factory manager and you're considered really good, you get, you know, a certain percentage of profit off of your place. But the amount of profit your factory earns is not part of your evaluation. The evaluation is totally subjective. This is a giant difference that we have, because we also enter right now another box that we're all in, and that almost all of you, probably all of you are in, which is in the Anglo-Axis. We really want things to be objective. We want to count things. That's how we think we have accountability, and we also want accountability. So we want to be evaluated objectively, and we want accountability for everything. There's not a lot of purpose, actually. If you step to that, if you step back, one, it's not universal. It's pretty clear in surveys that, especially in Asia, among the Japanese and among the Chinese, now I'm saying the Chinese from Taiwan, I'm not as certain about the Chinese from the People's Republic of China, they actually prefer subjective evaluations because they trust their boss. And they think their boss will be able to evaluate the effectiveness of their performance better than one of these numbers, because they know that these numbers actually are hugely impacted by stuff outside of the factory, right? And so that's not really, the numbers are objective versions of numbers, but they're not actually objective versions of the manager's performance. So most Asian managers in surveys and research studies prefer to have a subjective evaluation. Almost never does that happen out of an Anglo-Axis country. We all think that somehow the objective number is the way to go. And it's pervasive. It's so deeply entrenched, you know, in our guts, or remember, guts are heart or brainy, like wherever we entrench stuff, that we don't even question about whether that's wise or not. In fact, when I say this to people, they are usually stunned that I would say that a manager and the manager's department should be evaluated on total different systems and total different ways. But step back and say, here, I gave you the Scania goal. The manager's primary goal is to create an environment and a system where every worker can work to the best of their ability. Now stop for a second and say to yourself, what could be a better goal than that? Is it actually, like, can you come up with a better goal than that? And you say, well, profitability would be better than that? I'm not buying that argument. To me, that's just wrong. Profitability would be better. Cost reduction would be better. No. Try and come up in your own mind with something that you believe is a better goal to be evaluated against than the manager creates the opportunity for every employee to do their best work. And then, okay, so that seems to be pretty sharp as a goal. Then you figure out, is there a number way you can measure that given any of this stuff? No, not. So one of the problems we have in the Anglo-Axis is we do all this stuff and the numbers are, like all numbers, they have flaws to them, but then we use them for a purpose that sort of destroys the value. Because what happens if I'm a manager and I get evaluated by this and the performance is bad because of, COVID-19 or many things outside of my control, and this happens a couple times in a row, you know what will happen? I just will have contempt for the system at that point. You'll actually make me not trust my bosses or the system. And if they're lying to me, remember, ethics is a mutual street. Most humans, now, if you read spiritual or religious guidance, they would say this is not true. I think they're wrong. I think the truth is that most people, no matter how committed they are to spiritual excellence, if someone lies to them all the time, they will stop feeling compelled to tell the truth to that person. So anyone in an unethical environment will slowly become less ethical themselves about certain things. And I don't really care how spiritually committed they are, they will get tired after a while and give up. And what happens is everyone in the system will learn to lie after a while. If your performance evaluation is associated with this and you can see that things outside of your control, pretty soon you will just lie, cheat, and steal. And there are a lot of things you can do inside these systems to manipulate these numbers. You can both, change the accounting, not change them. You can have certain things not accounted for when they should have been accounted for. When you're supposed to go out and check and count items on the floor, you can actually not count everything, or you can take items that are on the floor and hide them where no one can find them. And then next period, you bring them out and then go, they're found again. That happens. That happens all the time. There is a lot of stuff that you can do. Down in the labor area, you can force some of your employees to work and not clock their time. You can do that based on, either they like you or they hate you, and you can do that multiple ways. You can get employees to work on, time and not clock it. You can definitely cheat this system. If the pressure is too big, everyone will ultimately fold. And one of the reasons is this connection of the manager is the department. It is a giant problem. And a lot of our competition doesn't have that. They don't really do it that I know of in the big countries in Sweden, although I don't know if it's pervasive in Sweden. I promise you it's absolutely pervasive in Japan. They would never even think of doing this. And when they find out that we do this, they're astonished that we could do anything as dumb as that. So So we have a system that has some problems, like all accounting systems, but then it's when we use this for types of control that it's not good for, then it starts to be a real problem. So that's one reason that the world-class people and lean accounting people want to just get rid of standard costing entirely. I'm not, as you know, not in favor of that. I think you just have to stop using it for evaluating your people. Is it okay for evaluating a department? Sure, it's fine. And if the department performs poorly for 5 or 6 years, that tells you, man, we ought to get out of that business. We ought to shut that department down and take those people and do something else with them. I would never advocate firing people, but getting rid of a product line, sure. If you can't make money off of it, stop it. So this evaluation will tell you whether you can make money off of a department or not. Okay, so that's one round of things to talk about. The other round is the system itself. Remember, I said it's the peak of intellectual and physical complexity that you'll find in accounting systems, except for fund accounting, which is totally stupid. You don't ever want to do that. Some of you will, I'm sorry to say, have to do that in your life. for historical reasons that are completely stupid, a lot of governmental agencies feel that they have to do fund accounting, which, you know, there might be some legislation somewhere that mandates it, but it's one of those, it's a meme, like, you know, someone started doing it a long time ago. And fund accounting is significantly more complex than this and gets you nowhere. It's just a giant waste of time. And because with a good budget and this system, you actually get more than you would get with fund accounting. So fund accounting is like a 150-year-old creation to meet a need that maybe you could have justified 150 years ago, but in today's world, it's not useful. So that would be the only thing that would be more complex than what we're seeing. However, another weakness here is there's no theory in this entire system. Okay? This entire system, and actually most of our accounting system, including our financial accounting system, is not really based on economic theory. We take some economic analysis and we will analyze certain pieces of it, but there's no unified economic theory that we use to drive the system as a whole. We will take certain assets and certain liabilities and apply, you know, fairly current thought about, you know, values, especially option prices, present values, things like that. But we never have ever looked at the entire system from an economic point of view. It's a historical accident. We started doing things, you know, 500 years ago, you know, in Italy, in diaries, stuff like that. And gradually it got more and more complicated. But underlying this is there's no theory. So that is actually a weakness here. Now, the reason I'm bringing it up is because there is a system that you can use that has theory. These are two very similar systems. The one that's more widely known as the German system, Grenzplan Kostenrechnung, which I've mentioned before. It actually, if you just look at casually and you're not an accountant, it actually looks very similar to this. But it's based on marginal cost economics from the first day, you know, like from the first second of thinking. That system was based on an economic stance. And so it turns out to be quite a bit better than ours. This is the Swedish version based on the same root. It's not quite the same as GPK, but it was based on the same economic theory. The Swedes and the Germans just took, you know, slightly different paths. It's based on the work of one specific economist whose name is Eugen Schmallenbach. I don't even, you know, you don't really have to know that, but this theory that this German guy developed in the late 1800s, people formed a school around him, but he wasn't an abstract economist in the way we think of economists today. He was definitely an economist, taught at the University of Cologne, but his focus was on, could he come up with an accounting system that would help German businesses be more effective? And he did a good job. Now, obviously, you know, still the same problem of trying to take the life of a lot of people and put it on two dimensions. So there's still weaknesses, but much, much stronger job than our logic here. Even though the system roughly looks the same, the implementation and definition of each of these things is based on economics. None of the definitions of any of this stuff is based on economics, but in this system it is. And it's widely available. You can do, you know, you can find it all in English. There's plenty of stuff. There's at least one hospital in Toronto that I know that has partially implemented GPK. And one of the biggest differences in the GPK and here is actually what I introduced a second ago. Departments. In that approach, the Swedish approach and the German approach, they have a theoretical definition of what a department is. And they don't just use any random creation of job titles. In this system, a department has to be a grouping of similar tasks. We ignore that. That's one reason that our system is weak. Is, you know, basically in a company, if I'm a good manager, you know, like if I can really get stuff done, gradually I will be getting more and more tasks. I'll get other little special work groups, you know, because I'm so talented, they'll just keep giving me stuff. So pretty soon my department's going to be doing like 4 different things because they've now assigned these different people to me because I'm competent. Okay? That creates a giant analysis problem. It means that the fixed and variable overhead is totally scrambled in a way you can't unscramble it or have any idea what's going on. It also has the labor rates scrambled. This, in the GPK and SJVK, they actually have a theoretical based accounting system that ignores the way departments are structured, and it says you have to have a theoretical definition of department. And each department can only do one thing. And they also say, this is another box, one manager in Germany or Sweden can be the boss of 3 different departments. We have another block we sort of inherited from the military called unity of command. And we pretty much assume that one manager can only control one department. We don't pretty much assume that. We presume that, and we don't allow any differences. So instead of saying that if I'm a talented manager, I can be the manager of 3 departments, we actually go in and change department definitions to say, oh, if you report to Paul, you're in Paul's department. This is a giant blunder, and it causes analytic problems that you cannot untangle. And it's one of the reasons that our systems have low levels of analyzability, and that the German and Swedish systems have very high level of analyzability. Is what they would do is they would keep each of these little groups separately and say, okay, Paul's a manager, but Paul is the boss of 3 departments. The only complexity they have there is how much of my time do they assign to each of those 3 or 4 departments. Everything else, they've reduced the complexity. And actually, if I'm only one person, I don't have to be that accurate. I can just be mildly accurate about how I allocate or report my allocation of time. And the system will work fine without all the scrambling. So this then is a big, big deal. And that means that actually the GPK gives results analytically that are very close to what activity-based costing would give. So if you have a choice, don't ever do activity-based costing in the journal entry system. The analysis is great. So activity-based analysis is wonderful. We all need to do it and learn it, but we should never put that stuff in the journal entries. I'll tell you why in chapter 10. What you should do, and I'm telling you, if you're the big boss, you look and try and go in this type of direction with departments being theoretically defined, separate departments from managers for evaluation, and then pick up either GPK or SJVK as your accounting system. It'll have a titanic impact. You'll have to learn about as you start, but there's complete material in English in both of these, fairly cheap, and especially this SJVK, the Swedish system, is designed to be implemented like an onion. The central system is simple. If you're like the people we have that use QuickBooks, use the central part of the system. When you grow a little bit bigger, you just add the new layer. You don't have to take the old layer out. That's how well written their model is actually you just put on a new layer and a new layer and a new layer. You never have to extract the old layer. So it's actually designed, this particular one, the Swedish version is not only designed to give you good results like the GPK, it's designed to be implementable in some sort of smart way. And then if you change and become smaller, you can just get rid of a few layers, and it coasts up, coasts down. It's much easier to deal with, and you can buy it. All the instructions are in English. They sell it because a lot of Swedish companies have overseas operations, and the Swedish company wants to use their home system in the overseas operation. So they have all the material available fairly cheaply in English. When I say fairly cheaply, the main manual is like 2,000 pages, and it costs about $1,000. And trust me, that's dirt cheap. That's almost free. Okay, so now we're close to the end. The other part of this little system, we're going to watch a video in a second, is accountability. That's another thing we have in the Anglo-Axis that is a problem. We have this compulsion to say everything should be you should be accountable. It's a miscue. I mean, you shouldn't have no accountability. You need some level, but somehow in our culture, we haven't figured out how to think about this as something that we balance. We just usually want more, and accountants are some of the people that want more because that's our job, right? Just like, anytime you have accountability, boy, more accountants are going to get a job because we've got to trace a bunch of stuff. But this also is a paradox, similar to that one where you have the managers and the departments joined together, and they shouldn't be, but we can't see that. the focus on accountability is something that we also have a problem with. Our culture really pushes way too high on that. Let's take a quick look at this video. So we're only going to look about a minute of it. And it's, I think, a pretty interesting one. So here we go. Jocko. Look at Jocko for a minute here. And let me just say one thing. This is a video you can watch on YouTube. Some parts of it are really good, but you know they're trying to put it in a military army kind of context to say it's really valuable. I guess I think that's bogus. But so you're going to see there's a bunch of military imagery in this as part of their selling proposition. Focus just on what this guy says, okay? And then I'll tell you who he is afterwards, and we can talk about it. Here we go. Jocko, take it on. Take it off. Take off.
Ordering people to do things does not work. You actually have to lead them. And that's another buzzword out there is accountability. You know, you got to be accountable. You got to hold your people accountable. And to me, accountability is a tool. It's a tool of leadership, but it's not the primary tool of leadership. It's actually a crutch. It's actually a tool to use when you don't pull off leadership correctly. So what you want to do, I talk about this all the time. I didn't hold my guys accountable. I didn't, walk down the line and inspect what they were doing. And no, I didn't have to hold them accountable. They wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to do what was aligned with the mission. I had to hold them back. Never mind make them do it. And that's what leadership is. It's not about accountability. It's about leading and getting them to lead themselves and getting them to take ownership of things. That's when you know you've succeeded as a leader, when you're just about out of a job.
There you go. So notice what he says. The point I want you to focus on is accountability and who it's coming from. So, there's something that we do. I don't know if I should say we, because I don't do it. Business people often look, especially men, often look for guidance to military stuff. And that's just ridiculous if you think about it. But it's in our culture, and we think of leadership as being a military thing, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of generals and colonels, they, have careers as consultants. And a lot of business people think of that as, important. And even though the word strategy, probably a big mistake, in a military strategy, you're trying to kill people and destroying your enemy, right? We don't want to do that in business strategy. We just want to get money. We don't really care. We're not, if you're trying to destroy your competitor, you're wasting a lot of energy. You shouldn't really be thinking about that other than you're learning from your competitor is one. But we actually have elements of our culture where we've picked up this military nonsense and I think completely misapplied it. Okay, so that's sort of telling you what's in my head about this. On the other hand, this, I think, is a good video, especially because this guy is a Navy SEAL 20 years. And I mean, if you look at his career, he started off as an enlisted man and became an officer. Okay? So that's really next to impossible in most military organizations. And yet he's very successful and respected. And normally I don't follow up on advice from officers about stuff. However, in this case, it's because it's paradoxical. Notice that he said very strongly that accountability is a sign, or a focus on accountability means that leadership has actually failed, because your guys, as he's calling them, your job as a leader is to make it so you guys want to do their stuff, not that you have to be chasing them around in circles and watching. Well, guess what standard costing is? Standard costing has the ability to be the biggest, most accountability-focused, crazed thing that you can possibly do, right? Because you're holding people accountable line by line for everything they touch. So it's sort of a box, right? It's a tool that if you're weak and frightened as a manager, you'll start to use this for accountability reasons and for evaluation reasons. And you'll lose most of the effectiveness. But that's what we did. I mean, every big company in the Anglo-Axis did that for 40 to 50 years and thought it was great. It took the Japanese kicking our butts, out of manufacturing before we realized there's another way to think. And actually, at the beginning, we just thought they were cheating, lying, lying, Asian scum, But then it took these guys a long time to realize they were actually onto a better way of thinking. In the early days, when I was in university, the professional word on the street was that it was very negative and very racist. And it was on top of something else. There was a lot of anti-Japan racism in North America for fairly reasonable reasons, or at least they were understandable reasons because of World War II. The Japanese were a particularly vicious and brutal enemy, and in my particular case, the west coast of the United States, every adult in my life had been in the military service. And the place I grew up in was a place that took a titanic number of casualties from the Japanese and had a lot of people that were tortured in Japanese prisoner of war camps. So, when I was in grade school, grade 5, grade 8, all of my male teachers were veterans of the Japanese theater. And they had fought against the Japanese. And actually, I have several relatives that were captured by the Japanese and ended up in prisoner of war camps. And the Japanese were pretty bad guys. They were, in terms of, for prisoners of war, they were much worse than the Germans, right? They treated their prisoners of war sort of more in the direction that the Germans treated the Holocaust, the Jews and other people who were in the concentration camps. The Germans were actually semi-okay with their treatment of prison POWs, okay? But the Japanese were not. They tortured most of them, the white ones sort of lived but were destroyed and tortured. If the Japanese, had anyone else, like from Vietnam or Thai or any other nationality, they just killed them all. So these guys were pretty rough. So the environment I grew up in, and when the Japanese started being effective in their manufacturing in the 1970s and 80s, most of the adults on the west coast of the US were incredibly hostile towards the Japanese. So they pretty much assumed that it was a bunch of cheating that the Japanese were doing for a long time. It took a lot of people and some generational change before we realized that Japanese were really onto a different way of thinking. For instance, I don't have the same reaction, to the Japanese that my, uncles and cousins would have. If you know your Japanese history, Battle of Corregidor, the Bataan Death March. Basically, I probably had like 7, 8 cousins in the Bataan Death March because the unit that was captured, one of the units that was captured was a New Mexico division, which is where my whole family's from for like 300 years out of New Mexico in the U.S. That was a division that was captured and marched through that thing. So all through New Mexico were the survivors and a huge amount of anti-Japanese hostility. So it took us a while to realize, we had to overcome a lot of boxes, and some of the old guys just had to die. They couldn't, overcome their anger and frustration. It's tough to do, and we'll see that going through time. It's hard to overcome some of those thoughts.